What if one broken man and one loyal German shepherd could turn a rusted food truck into a second chance not only for themselves, but for an entire community? What if the darkest nights of trauma and fear led to a moment where a dog pulled his owner from the edge and guided him toward hope again? This is the journey of Ethan and Ranger, a story of struggle, resilience, and quiet miracles that unfold when people choose to stand together. I hope you enjoy this story. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The early morning settled gently over the outskirts of the small Appalachian town, where low clouds drifted across the tops of the dark trees, and a soft layer of mist clung to the forest floor. A faint wind moved through the pines with a cool breath that carried the scent of wet bark and distant wood smoke. The air held a quiet stillness that wrapped around a small rented cabin resting close to the forest line. The cabin leaned slightly, as if age had pressed its weight upon the wooden beams for too many years. This lonely dwelling belonged to Ethan Brooks, a man of 40 years who carried the worn look of someone shaped by the hard edges of war. Ethan had the build of a soldier who once marched across harsh terrain under crushing heat, broad-shouldered and strong-armed. But the years after Afghanistan had carved deep marks into his expression. His face was tanned but tired, with a rough layer of stubble that darkened his jaw and chin. His hair was short and dark brown, showing early streaks of gray at the temples. His eyes were a muted blue, steady but shadowed, as if the weight of memories pressed behind them every moment of the day. Ethan lived a quiet life in this small cabin, waking each morning to the reality of bills due, repair jobs waiting, and the constant effort to hold himself together. His income came from labor work in town, where he repaired engines, lifted heavy materials, and did whatever tasks would pay enough to keep food on the table and the lights on. His hands were strong, but covered in small scars and lines from years of handling hot metal and rough tools. Though he stayed polite with the people he worked around, he rarely offered more than a simple nod or a brief greeting, keeping a steady distance that made it easier to hide the storms moving inside him. What kept Ethan steady each day was Ranger, the German shepherd who had followed him out of the war and into this isolated corner of the mountains. Ranger was 6 years old, with a large and muscular frame covered in a sable coat blending shades of deep brown and black. His ears stood tall and alert. His amber eyes were sharp and intelligent, giving him the appearance of a guardian who missed nothing. Ranger had saved Ethan once during a deployment overseas by pushing him away from danger seconds before an explosion shook the ground. Since then, the dog had remained at Ethan's side with an unwavering loyalty that went beyond instinct. Ranger knew Ethan's breathing patterns, sensed every shift in his mood, and could read the tremors that sometimes moved through Ethan's body when old memories resurfaced. Each night, when the sun fell behind the ridge and shadows spread across the cabin walls, Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The quiet dark reminded him of places he had tried to forget. When he lay down, sleep rarely came gently. The moment his eyes closed, he felt the pull of memories snapping against him like stretched wire. At times, he saw flashes of sand-filled wind, cramped shelters, and the echo of distant blasts. Other times, he felt the heavy pressure of trying to protect others while fearing he would not survive himself. His breathing would quicken as if someone tightened an invisible grip on his ribs. His hands sometimes curled into fists against the sheets. It was during these episodes that Ranger rose from his spot near the door and stepped quietly to Ethan's side. The dog pressed his head against Ethan's chest, grounding the frantic rhythm of his heart. Ethan would place a trembling hand on Ranger's neck, feeling the steady warmth of the dog body. Ranger's presence reminded Ethan that he was no longer in a place where danger crawled with every gust of wind. Ranger stayed until the fear loosened its hold and Ethan could breathe again. When morning came, Ethan forced himself out of bed with the slow determination of someone fighting an unseen force. He brewed coffee on an old metal stove, drank it in silence, and prepared for the day ahead. Ranger ate beside him, chewing calmly before lifting his head to watch Ethan with patient attentiveness. Once Ethan stepped outside, Ranger followed close behind, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The road into town was long and uneven, cutting through trees that rose in tall lines along the edges. Ethan drove quietly, keeping the window cracked to let in the cool forest air. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, upright and watchful. At work, Ethan kept to himself. The garage smelled of oil and rust, a familiar scent he had known since he was a teenager, learning to repair engines long before war had changed him. The other men respected his skill, but rarely asked about his past. They saw the way Ranger stayed close and sensed that Ethan carried something heavy that no conversation would easily touch. When loud noises echoed through the shop, Ethan's body tensed. Ranger reacted instantly, stepping near Ethan's leg to steady him. Ethan's breath would slow again, with the dog presence anchoring him. As evening settled, Ethan returned home with Ranger resting in the seat beside him. He cooked simple meals, often skipping dinner when exhaustion pushed deeper than hunger. Ranger ate his food with steady bites, then followed Ethan from room to room, never letting him slip too far into solitude. The cabin was old and cramped, with worn flooring and pale curtains that fluttered with every draft of wind. But it was one place where Ethan could let his guard lower, even just a little. As the sun dropped behind the mountains and darkness crept into the woods, Ethan felt a familiar weight sink into his chest. Some nights, he tried to read or patch a torn jacket to distract himself. Other nights, he simply sat at the table staring at the quiet forest through the window. Ranger lay close, watching him with calm patience. Ethan often wondered what life would have become if Ranger had not followed him out of that final deployment. He understood that without the dog, some nights might have been too heavy to survive. The day ended, as it often did, with Ethan lying awake in the low light of the cabin, eyes fixed on the ceiling. When another wave of memory surged through him, his breath caught and his thoughts returned to the desert once more. Ranger stepped onto the bed, heavy paws settling gently as he curled beside Ethan. The steady rise and fall of the dog breathing eased the trembling in Ethan's chest. He placed one hand on Ranger's warm fur, grateful for the silent presence that anchored him in a world that still felt too fragile. In the dark quiet of the Appalachian woods, Ethan Brooks faced the long night with Ranger beside him, holding on to the only constant that had never abandoned him since the war. And though each day was a struggle, he carried the quiet hope that with Ranger beside him, he could survive one more night, then another, and slowly build a life that did not collapse under the pressure of his memories. The afternoon settled over the small Appalachian town with a dull gray haze that drifted between the old buildings and the forest edge. The air was cool, but not cold, carrying the faint scent of drying leaves and motor oil from the nearby repair shops. A steady breeze pressed against the worn wooden walls of the garage where Ethan Brooks finished another long day of labor. Ranger sat near the open door, his strong body still and attentive, ears raised as he watched Ethan wipe grease from his hands. The town bustled quietly around them. Cars rolled slowly along the narrow street. People walked with deliberate steps, wrapped in jackets that shielded them from the creeping mountain chill. Ethan moved through this world with the steady rhythm of a man who had learned to live quietly and carefully. His broad shoulders often slumped under invisible weight, and his blue eyes drifted downward when he was lost in thought. Today, his thoughts were heavy, pressing deeper than usual. Bills stacked on his small kitchen table at home, repairs on his truck that he could barely afford, rent that lingered at the edge of overdue. He felt as if each day pushed him closer to a line he could not see, yet feared he might cross. Ranger sensed it. The German shepherd nudged Ethan's leg gently, offering silent support. Ethan placed a tired hand on the dog's back and breathed slowly, grounding himself. As the day wound down, Ethan heard a conversation between two mechanics near the back of the garage. Both men spoke in low tones about someone selling an old food truck that had been rusting behind a storage yard on the far side of town. They mentioned that the owner wanted to get rid of it quickly, for a small amount of money, because it had taken up space for too long. The words struck Ethan like a quiet spark. He paused his movements and listened. The idea of a food truck was not new to him. Before the war, he had spent weekends helping his uncle cook simple meals for community events. His uncle had been a tall and broad man, with thick hands and a rough voice, but a gentle heart. He had taught Ethan how to season meat, how to fry potatoes, and how food brought people together without effort or judgment. Those memories surfaced now, offering a faint warmth. Ethan had always imagined that if he could start over one day, he would build something simple and honest, something that let him work with his hands without the noise of engines or the weight of sadness. The thought of a small food business had wandered through his mind many times over the years, but had always felt unreachable. Now the possibility lingered again through the voices of the men behind him. He finished cleaning the tools and locked the garage door behind him. As he walked toward his truck, Ranger followed close, Paws silent on the gravel. Ethan rested his arm on the open window frame and stared ahead. A part of him wanted to dismiss the idea immediately. His bank balance was thin. His expenses were constant. His confidence was fragile. He had failed to rebuild his life more than once, and the thought of another failure pressed against his chest like a slow tightening. Yet another part of him felt something he had not felt in a long time. A small and fragile spark of hope. He turned the key in his old truck, and the engine rumbled to life with a familiar shudder. Ranger sat tall in the passenger seat, eyes fixed on Ethan's face. The dog felt the shift inside him, sensing the hesitation mixed with longing. Ethan drove across town with the slow caution of someone who expected obstacles at every turn. The houses gave way to open lots and storage yards scattered along a narrow dirt road. When he reached the final yard, at the edge of a small field, he found a man locking a metal gate. The man was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a compact frame and a rough face carved with deep lines. His hair was short and gray, and his hands were darkened with years of work. His posture suggested a life spent hauling, lifting, and managing heavy things that rarely stayed where they belonged. Though tired, his eyes held the sharpness of someone who had survived many seasons of hardship. Ethan stepped out of his truck cautiously. Ranger stood beside him, alert but calm. The man looked at Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, like someone who had met too many people interested in good deals but unwilling to commit. Ethan explained that he had heard about an old food truck parked behind the storage yard. The man nodded and walked toward the back fence. Ranger followed with careful steps, tail steady. Behind a row of metal containers sat a faded truck with rust creeping across its edges. The paint, once bright blue, had chipped away in long, uneven strips. The tires sagged slightly. The door to the back kitchen area was dented, and the window was clouded by dust. It looked tired and forgotten. Yet something about it sparked a gentle pull in Ethan's chest. He approached the truck and rested one hand on the metal frame. The surface felt cold and rough. The lines of rust told stories of years spent in rain and sun. Ethan stepped closer and peered inside. The counters were worn. Some appliances were missing. The shelves rattled when he pushed on them. It was a wreck, but a fixable wreck. A small shape of a dream still clung to it. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. He pictured himself standing inside the truck, handing a warm meal to someone who needed it, hearing the quiet hum of a small business slowly growing. He imagined Ranger lying near the door, watching people approach with his calm and loyal presence. The older man gave Ethan a frank look. His expression softened as he noticed the way Ethan studied the truck with both desperation and longing. He knew that look. He had seen it in people searching for a chance to start over. The man told Ethan the price with a simple tone. It was surprisingly low, almost too low, suggesting that he simply wanted the vehicle gone more than he wanted profit. Ethan felt a deep pull in his chest. His throat tightened. He had enough money, but barely. If he bought the truck, he would be left with almost nothing until the next paycheck. The risk pressed heavily on him. His mind flashed to overdue bills, the repairs he still needed for his own truck, and the fear that if this attempt failed, he would lose more than money. He would lose what little hope he still carried. Ranger nudged Ethan's leg gently. The dog amber eyes were steady and warm. It was as if Ranger reminded him that the two of them had survived far worse things than financial risk. They had survived nights of fear, days of battle, and years of rebuilding themselves from the inside out. Ethan slowly inhaled and let the breath settle through him. He reached into his pocket and felt the worn edges of his wallet. Every bill inside represented hours of labor, sweat, and pain. But it also represented the possibility of something new. Something theirs. He counted the money and handed it to the man. The weight lifted from his hand and settled deep in his chest. The man nodded with a simple acceptance and stepped aside. The old food truck now belonged to Ethan. Ethan placed his hand once more on the rusted frame. The cold metal seemed to hum with potential. Ranger stood beside him, tail lowering in calm confidence. Ethan knew that he had taken a risk that could change his life or break it further. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the quiet glow of a new beginning rising somewhere inside him. With Ranger at his side, Ethan turned toward his truck, ready to bring home the rusted vehicle that might become the first real step toward rebuilding not just his livelihood, but his sense of purpose. The late morning air hung still over the edge of the Appalachian woods as a thin layer of gray clouds drifted slowly across the sky. The breeze felt cool, but gentle, barely strong enough to move the tops of the tall pines surrounding Ethan's cabin. A soft smell of damp soil mixed with old motor oil lingered around the small clearing where Ethan had parked the rusted food truck he had recently bought. The day had begun with cautious hope. Ethan stood beside the truck with Ranger sitting near his boots. Ethan's shoulders were tense but steady. He had woken early with a determination he had not felt in a long time. The food truck represented a chance to change his life and give himself purpose again. Though the cost had nearly emptied his pockets, Ethan carried a quiet belief that hard work could bring the old metal shell back to life. His broad hands held a set of tools that bore the marks of years spent in repair shops and battlefields. His fingers were scarred and strong, but trembled slightly whenever he felt memories rise too close. Ranger watched him with unwavering attention. The German shepherd carried himself with a proud stance, ears raised and amber eyes bright beneath his sable coat. He was ready to assist his owner in whatever way a dog could. The morning passed quietly as Ethan worked. He removed old bolts, cleaned rusted panels, and crawled beneath the truck to inspect the frame. The forest around him hummed with insects and distant birds. Ranger paced around the clearing, occasionally lying down to rest his head on his paws, but always keeping Ethan within sight. Ethan felt a mix of determination and worry. The truck needed far more work than he had expected. The metal beneath showed years of neglect. Some parts were bent, others were rotted through. He knew the project would take months and more strength than he was sure he still had. But he also knew that turning back was not an option. Failure meant sliding deeper into the shadow of his past. Success meant a chance to rebuild his place in the world. As the sun climbed higher and the air grew warmer, Ethan slid beneath the truck to reach the lower frame. A heavy jack held the side of the vehicle above him. He moved slowly and carefully, adjusting tools and tightening a worn bolt. Sweat dripped down his temples and along his jaw. The metal above him creaked from the shifting weight. He felt uneasy for a moment, sensing the tension in the old machinery, but pushed the worry aside and continued working. Inside his mind, thoughts drifted to the pressure on his shoulders. Bills due, rent late, food supplies running thin. The weight of responsibility grew heavier each day, pressing against memories he tried to suppress. While he worked, a sudden sharp sound cut through the quiet. The jack groaned. Before Ethan could react, it snapped. Metal slammed downward. The heavy underside of the truck dropped violently, trapping Ethan between the cold ground and the crushing weight. Pain shot through his chest and ribs. His breath froze. Dust exploded into his face. Panic surged with terrifying speed. The world tightened around him like iron. He tried to move, but his legs were pinned. His arms strained against the weight, but could not lift it. A flash of memory struck him. Collapsing structures overseas. Screams buried beneath rubble. The sensation twisted his breath into a short, trembling gasp. Ethan's eyes widened. His heartbeat hammered against the metal pressing into him. The forest dimmed around the edges of his vision. Ranger jumped instantly to attention. His ears snapped forward. He rushed toward the truck, barking in urgent bursts. The dog circled the fallen jack, sniffed the corners, pushing his nose beneath the lowered frame, whining sharply as if urging Ethan to move. Ethan's voice was trapped in his throat. Panic tightened around him like a fist. Ranger backed up and sprinted toward the dirt road leading to the nearest house. His paws beat urgently against the ground. Ranger was fast and powerful, his muscles working in perfect coordination as he ran. The closest neighbor lived down the hill. The neighbor was a man named Mark Evans, a tall and lean figure in his late 40s, with short black hair streaked with early gray. His face was narrow, with deep lines that suggested years of physical work. His skin had the rough texture of someone used to lifting lumber and repairing fences. His eyes were brown and observant, belonging to a man who listened more than he spoke. Mark had always been polite toward Ethan when they crossed paths, offering brief nods without intruding on his solitude. When Ranger reached his yard, the dog barked loudly, circling in frantic motions. Mark stepped out of his shed with confusion in his expression, holding a pair of heavy work gloves. Ranger barked again and darted a few steps away, then returned and barked louder. Realization struck Mark quickly. He dropped the gloves and followed Ranger at a run. When they reached the clearing, Mark immediately saw the collapsed truck and Ethan pinned beneath it. His eyes widened. Though he did not know the details of Ethan's past, Mark recognized the danger. Without hesitation, he rushed to the truck, planted his boots firmly in the dirt, and grabbed the steel frame. His arms trembled with the weight, but he pulled with every ounce of strength. Ranger pushed himself under the edge, nudging Ethan's shoulder, trying desperately to lift with his body, though the weight was far too much. After several grueling seconds, Mark managed to lift the corner just enough for Ranger to wedge himself closer and bark sharply in Ethan's face, snapping him back into focus. Ethan lifted his arm with the last of his fading strength and dragged himself out from under the heavy frame. He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air as pain throbbed through his side. Mark lowered the truck back down carefully, breathing heavily. He knelt beside Ethan, checking for broken bones with gentle pressure. Mark's expression softened with concern. He saw the tremor in Ethan's hands, the fear still clinging to him. Mark understood that the injury was more than physical. Ethan's chest rose and fell in uneven waves. Ranger pressed his body firmly against Ethan's side, grounding him the same way he always did during nights of panic. Ethan's eyes were distant, unfocused. It was clear the accident had shaken him not only because of the danger, but because it pulled him back into the mental battlefield he fought every night. Mark placed a steady hand near Ethan's shoulder. He did not know the details of Ethan's trauma, but he knew the haunted look well enough to stay grounded and calm beside him. After a long moment, Ethan managed to sit upright. His breath steadied. His chest ached, but the weight of the truck had not crushed his ribs. Ranger remained glued to his side, eyes watching Ethan every slight movement. Slowly, Ethan rose to his feet with Mark's support. Mark discreetly looked Ethan over again. He noticed the scars on Ethan's arms, the tired slump in his shoulders, the deep lines carved by stress around his eyes. He quietly realized how much the man carried and how alone he had been. By the time Ethan walked back toward the cabin porch, several other neighbors had gathered near the clearing, drawn by Ranger's earlier barks and the echo of the accident. They stood silently for a moment, watching Ethan with new understanding. Some had seen his distant behavior before and assumed he preferred isolation. Now they saw something deeper. They saw a man carrying heavy wounds that did not show until moments like this. Ethan lowered himself onto the porch step, holding his side as Ranger lay pressed against his boots. Ethan felt exposed, not only because of the accident, but because the people around him now saw cracks in the mask he had worn for years. His breath slowed. His thoughts steadied. He knew he had survived the accident only because Ranger had acted quickly. The dog loyalty had saved his life again. As the neighbors stepped closer to offer help, Ethan looked at them with a quiet mixture of gratitude and discomfort. For years he had lived unseen and untouched, but now they had witnessed the raw fear he tried so hard to bury. In that moment, the truth settled into the hearts of those around him. Ethan Brooks was a man fighting a battle no one had understood until now. And for the first time, the town glimpsed the depth of those unseen scars etched into his soul. A pale afternoon light settled over the quiet clearing behind Ethan's small rental house as thin clouds drifted slowly across the sky. The air held a mild chill that signaled the changing season. A faint scent of damp leaves mixed with the metallic smell of old machinery, spreading softly around the weathered food truck parked near the open garage. The day appeared calm, but Ethan's mind churned beneath the stillness. Since the accident under the truck, he had moved with more caution, stopping often when memories pulled too close. Today he worked slowly, pausing whenever the echo of panic returned. Ethan stood beside the truck, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of recent fear. His ribs were still sore from the close call, and his breath came uneven whenever he remembered how quickly everything could have ended. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted a rusted panel and placed it aside. Ranger stayed close, his strong body brushing Ethan's leg from time to time as if grounding him. The German Shepherd carried his usual alert posture. His coat was a blend of browns and blacks that caught the afternoon light, making him look powerful and steadfast. His amber eyes followed every movement Ethan made, calm yet vigilant, as though ready to react to any danger that might return. Ethan drew a long breath and tried to focus. He knew that if he wanted to give the truck a second life, he needed to press forward. The structure was old, lined with dents and scratches from years of use. Every drawer, every hinge, every surface carried the marks of a past long forgotten. Ethan had been stripping old parts throughout the morning. He removed metal trays, loose wiring, and worn shelves until the interior felt more open. Dust floated in the air with each movement. The quiet was broken only by the occasional creak of the truck frame and Ranger's soft breaths. As Ethan shifted to the side panel, Ranger unexpectedly lifted his head. The dog ears pricked up sharply. His posture straightened, and he moved toward a lower cabinet near the back of the truck. Ranger sniffed the corners and let out a low rumble in his throat. Not aggressive, but insistent. Ethan frowned gently and walked toward him. Ranger placed one paw against the small metal cabinet door that sat lower than the others. The hinges were stiff with rust, and a small lock hung crookedly from the latch. Ethan knelt down. The lock was old and brittle. He felt along the edges of the door. It did not match the rest of the truck. Someone had reinforced it long ago, making it stronger than the surrounding panels. Ranger nudged the door again with focused determination. Ethan sensed that the dog had noticed something he had not. His hands were steady now, guided by curiosity. He retrieved a small pry bar from the nearby toolbox. The metal scraped against the latch as he applied pressure. Rust cracked and dust scattered. After one firm pull, the lock snapped free. He pushed the door open. Inside lay a small wooden box, pressed against the back wall of the compartment. It was covered in a thin layer of dust. The lid was worn smooth from age, but the box itself had been carefully protected. Ethan lifted it out slowly. It felt heavier than he expected. Ranger sniffed the box, then sat down beside Ethan with calm patience. Ethan's chest tightened with a quiet ache. The way Ranger watched him reminded him of their time overseas, when one moment of hesitation could change everything. He brushed away dust and eased the lid open. Inside lay a stack of envelopes bound with a simple strip of cloth. Ethan unfolded them gently. The first thing he saw was a faded photograph of a woman holding a young child beside the very same food truck. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s. She was slender, with warm brown eyes and dark hair tied back in a loose braid. Her smile was bright, yet carried a hint of exhaustion. Her skin bore the tan of someone who worked outdoors for long hours. She had the look of a person who carried heavy responsibility with quiet strength. The child in the picture was no older than 5, a small boy with soft curls of light brown hair and round cheeks. His eyes sparkled with the carefree innocence of youth as he held onto the woman's arm. Ethan stared at the photo and felt a slow heaviness in his chest, not born of pain, but of something deeper: understanding. The envelopes beneath the photo were filled with short letters. The handwriting was careful, though the ink had faded unevenly. Each letter told small pieces of the woman's life. She wrote about the struggle of raising her son alone. She described the long days spent cooking meals in the truck to sell at local parks and school events. She confessed her hope to turn the truck into a mobile kitchen that served free food to children whose families could not afford hot meals. She wrote of saving spare change to replace old parts and dreaming of restoring the truck to its full potential. The final letter was wrapped separately. The paper was softer, worn from being handled many times. Ethan unfolded it with care. The message inside was simple. It was a note addressed to whoever found the truck after she was gone. The words expressed her hope that someone would continue her dream of using the truck to help children in need. She wrote with a voice full of sincerity and determination, as if she believed the truck itself held a purpose that could outlive her. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he read. His breath deepened. His thoughts moved slowly through the layers of meaning. This truck had been something more than a machine. It had carried someone's dream, someone's hope for a better life for those who had even less. He sat still for a long time. Ranger pressed gently against him, sensing his shifting emotions. Ethan's mind drifted to his own past, to the faces of children he had seen overseas, to the harshness of conflict and the way simple acts of kindness had meant more than any weapon. He remembered the night Ranger had saved him. The moment he realized survival was not a promise, but a gift. Now he held the story of a woman who had poured her struggles and her heart into this truck. The weight of her hope rested in the small box on his lap. Ethan felt something stir inside him. It was not the heavy dread of responsibility. It was not the fear that often rose uninvited. It was a quiet sense of direction. The truck was not just his way out of hardship. It was a bridge to someone else's unfinished work, a chance to honor a dream that had not been completed. Ethan lifted the photograph again. The woman's smile felt warm and brave. The child's eyes were filled with trust. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling a steady resolve build within him. He knew the work ahead would be difficult. He knew the repairs would demand time, money, and strength. But he also knew he could not ignore what he had found. Ranger placed his paw gently on Ethan's leg. The gesture held no urgency, only support, only presence. Ethan nodded to himself. The decision settled quietly but firmly in his heart. He would keep going, not only for himself, not only for Ranger, but for the dream left behind in the letters of a woman he had never met, a dream that deserved one more chance to live. The night settled heavily over the small clearing at the edge of the Appalachian woods. A thin mist drifted between the trees and muted the glow of the moon. The cold air carried the smell of damp bark and old earth. The food truck sat quietly beside the garage, its worn metal reflecting only faint silver light. It had been a long day for Ethan, filled with the weight of letters he had found in the hidden compartment. He had read them again and again until his eyes blurred. The story of the woman and her child stayed with him. Her hope clung to his thoughts and set a quiet fire inside him. Now he stood at the small window of his rental home, watching the darkness settle across the yard. Ranger rested near his feet with his head on his paws, eyes half closed, but still responsive to every subtle movement outside. Ethan leaned his hand on the window frame. His mind was tired. The accident under the truck, the hidden letters, and the constant pull of financial worries made sleep difficult. He needed quiet. He needed rest. But the night had become unsettling in recent days. Ethan had noticed shapes moving at the edge of the trees. Once or twice he had stepped outside and seen nothing. Another time he thought he heard footsteps near the truck. He told himself it was his imagination or the wind pressing through the branches. Yet the feeling of being watched crept deeper into him each night. He sat down heavily on the small couch. Ranger lifted his head and studied Ethan with sharp eyes. The dog seemed to sense Ethan's restless thoughts. Ethan reached down and let his fingers trail through Ranger's thick coat. The act calmed him, but only slightly. Hours passed. The night grew deeper. The house remained silent except for the faint ticking of an old wall clock. Ethan's eyes grew heavy, but he forced himself to stay awake. Something told him the night was not done with him yet. Ranger suddenly stood. His ears snapped upright. His body stiffened. A low growl rolled through his chest. Ethan's heart raced. He rose to his feet and moved slowly to the window. The yard lay in near darkness, but the outline of the truck was visible. He saw a shadow move near it, a slow, stumbling figure. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Ranger growled louder now, pacing in short, sharp movements. Ethan stepped outside quietly. The ground was cool beneath his boots. Ranger walked ahead, body crouched low, ready to act. As they neared the truck, Ethan saw the figure more clearly. A man stood hunched over the side panel of the truck. His shoulders were broad, but slouched with the weight of intoxication. His clothes were dirty and loose, hanging from a thin frame. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with long, unkempt hair and a patchy beard. His face held deep lines and a dullness in the eyes that came from years of drinking. The man gripped a metal pipe with shaking hands. He hit the truck side as if trying to pry something loose. His movements were clumsy but determined. Ethan recognized the type. A drifter from the nearby road. A man lost to alcohol and desperation. Someone who saw metal and thought only of scrap money. Ethan's body tensed with both fear and anger. The truck was not just metal. It held someone's dream. His dream now. He stepped forward, but Ranger moved faster. The German Shepherd launched into a loud burst of barks, deep and sharp. The man spun around, startled. His eyes widened at the sight of the large dog rushing toward him. Ranger did not attack. He stood his ground with his body arched forward, ears pinned, tail stiff. His bark echoed through the trees with a force that made the man stumble backward. Ethan moved quickly and stood several paces behind Ranger. He kept his voice firm but low. The man stepped away from the truck. His legs shook under him. He muttered something Ethan could not understand, then dropped the metal pipe and fled toward the road, tripping over branches as he disappeared into the dark. Ranger stood alert until the last sound of footsteps faded. Only when silence returned did he lower his posture. Ethan released a slow breath. His chest felt tight from the adrenaline. Ranger looked up at him with bright amber eyes, tail beginning to sway gently now that the threat had passed. Ethan knelt beside him. He placed one hand on the dog's strong neck and felt a swell of gratitude. Ranger had protected him again, protected the truck, protected the fragile dream that had begun forming in Ethan's heart. The near theft made everything sharper. The truck was vulnerable. Desperation could come from anywhere. Ethan realized that if he wanted to carry the woman dream and build his own future, he would need to guard this vehicle with more than hope. The fear of losing the truck clung to him. Yet another feeling rose beneath it. Determination. Stronger than before. More grounded. The letters he had found had shown him a path. Ranger loyalty had reminded him why he could not turn back. Standing in the cool night air, Ethan understood that this attempt to damage the truck was not just a warning. It was a test. A moment meant to decide whether he would protect what mattered. Ethan straightened, placed his hand on the truck side, and looked at the dark woods around him. He knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not give up. The dream, inside the old letters, was alive again, and he would defend it. A gray morning light hung low over the Appalachian clearing as a thin drizzle coated the ground. The air felt heavy with moisture, and the smell of wet earth clung to every surface. A cold breeze whispered through the tall pines above Ethan's small rented home while the food truck stood motionless beside the garage. The sky carried the weight of approaching storm clouds, and the quiet atmosphere reflected the exhaustion that had been growing inside Ethan. For days, Ethan had been sinking deeper into a dark fog. The cost of repairing the food truck was far greater than he had imagined. Each new part he inspected seemed to reveal another broken piece beneath it. His savings had dropped to nearly nothing. The rent deadline loomed over him like a shadow he could not escape. His chest tightened each time he thought about what would happen if he failed. The letters he had found inside the hidden compartment had inspired him, but even inspiration could not erase the relentlessness of reality. His mind had grown heavier with each passing hour. Ethan stood in the garage with tools scattered around him. His shoulders slumped forward. His beard was untrimmed, and the dark hair at his temples hung limp across his forehead. His blue eyes were dim with exhaustion and sleepless nights. He tried to focus on the task in front of him, but the ache in his head made it difficult. The familiar fog of PTSD pressed against him again. His breath grew shallow. His palms dampened. He remembered the sound of collapsing structures and distant explosions. He blinked hard, but the memories clung to him, pulling him away from the present moment. Ranger watched him from the corner of the garage. The German shepherd sat with his body low and tense. His coat glistened from the mist outside. His strong muscles shifted with each subtle movement, alert to every change in Ethan's posture. Ranger sensed Ethan's mental slide long before Ethan acknowledged it himself. The dog slowly walked forward and pressed his head against Ethan's leg. The warmth steadied Ethan for a brief moment, but even that could not stop the crushing pressure he felt. Ethan whispered to himself in a strained breath. He felt trapped between responsibility and despair. Every step forward seemed to reveal a new setback. The engine needed more work. The electrical system needed replacement. The body panels needed reinforcement. Bills piled on the counter inside the house. Rent letters sat unopened. Ethan ran a hand over his face. His ribs still ached from the accident. His mind felt fragile. A tremor passed through him as he stared at the half-repaired truck. He felt the urge to close the garage door and walk away. To leave the truck dark and unfinished. To stop fighting a battle he believed he could not win. He reached for the door handle. Ranger moved instantly. The dog stepped in front of him and lay down across the threshold. His large body blocked the entrance, and his eyes locked onto Ethan with quiet firmness. Ranger did not bark. He did not push. He simply refused to move. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Ranger presence was steady and unmoving. It was the same unwavering loyalty that had saved him overseas and in the accident days earlier. Ethan sank to one knee beside him. The emotions he had suppressed rose like heavy waves inside his chest. He felt tired. He felt unworthy. He felt overwhelmed by the expectations he placed on himself. His hand shook as he touched Ranger's strong shoulder. For a moment, he stayed very still with his head bowed. Unknown to Ethan, help was already making its way up the road. The first to arrive was a man named Harold Dean, an older mechanic from the neighboring town. Harold was in his late 60s, with broad hands and a back that had curved slightly with age. His hair was silver and cropped close. His face carried deep lines cut from decades of labor and loss. His calm voice and quiet manner revealed a man who had seen hardship, but still chose patience. Harold stepped into the clearing, holding a box of metal parts. He nodded once toward Ethan, not prying into the struggle he could clearly see. Moments later, Mildred Hart arrived. She was the owner of the small general store by the main road. She was a short woman in her early 70s with thinning white hair tied neatly at the back of her head. Her skin was pale with soft wrinkles, and her eyes were warm but sharp. She carried a paper bag filled with canned food and bread. Her personality carried a blend of stern practicality and genuine kindness. Behind her came two veterans Ethan had spoken to only a handful of times. One was Daniel Kerr, a man in his mid-50s with a calm demeanor and a solid build shaped by years of military training. His dark brown skin and short-trimmed beard gave him a grounded presence. He had a quiet seriousness that showed he had fought his own battles returning home. The other was Ray Butler, a younger veteran in his early 40s. He was tall and lean with sandy hair and light freckles across his face. His eyes were clear, but carried a distant look that hinted at memories he rarely spoke about. Daniel held a small crate of spare bolts, while Ray carried wiring coils over his shoulder. Ethan lifted his head slowly when he heard footsteps approach. He saw the group standing at the edge of the garage. Their presence was unexpected. No speeches, no questions, just quiet support. Harold set the box on the workbench. Mildred placed the bag of food by the door. Daniel and Ray stood ready with tools. Ethan did not speak. His throat felt tight. His breath trembled inside him. He looked from one face to the next, and then down at Ranger. The dog tail moved slowly in recognition of safety returning. Ethan felt the pressure inside him loosen, even if just slightly. These people had come willingly to stand beside him, to offer parts, to offer food, to offer presence. They did not see him as a burden. They did not question his pain. Their arrival was enough to break through the wall he had been pushing against all morning. Ethan rose to his feet slowly. He was not fully steady, but he stood. Ranger moved to his side and remained there. Ethan nodded once to the group, a simple gesture carrying more meaning than words. Harold placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. Mildred gave him a small, approving glance. Daniel and Ray stepped forward with their tools. The garage no longer felt like a place of defeat. In that moment, Ethan realized he had not been fighting alone. And for the first time in many days, he allowed himself to believe that the dream inside the old letters might still be possible. A cold night wind drifted through the Appalachian clearing as faint clouds passed across the dim moon. The air carried the smell of metal, damp pine, and the lingering scent of electrical solvent from the garage. A thin line of smoke from Ethan's earlier welding work clung lightly to the air. The food truck stood beneath the pale light, its frame partially restored, its edges showing new life mixed with old rust. Inside the garage, Ethan worked with a steady determination, though his breath came tight and shallow. The long days of effort and the weight of responsibility had carved deeper shadows beneath his tired blue eyes. His hair hung slightly across his forehead, still damp from the cold night air. His hands were rough and cracked, marked by weeks of strain. Ranger remained near him, with a poised and attentive posture. The German Shepherd coat glowed faintly in the faint light. His ears stayed alert, and his amber eyes followed every step Ethan took. Behind them, on the workbench, lay tools brought by Harold Dean, wires carried by Ray Butler, and spare parts provided by Daniel Kerr. Mildred Hart had left food on the counter earlier that day, and the entire group had agreed to return in the morning to continue working beside Ethan. Tonight, Ethan stayed behind to test the newly rewired electrical system. He wanted to move carefully through the final section of the wiring harness before the group arrived again. His movements were methodical, but tense. Each click of the metal connectors echoed loudly in the confined garage. A tremor slipped through his hand as he lifted the final cable. He forced himself to breathe deeper. The memories that trailed behind him had grown quieter in recent days, thanks to the support around him, but they never disappeared completely. Ethan crouched beside the front panel of the truck and connected the new line. Ranger shifted his stance, sensing Ethan's focus tighten. The moment felt fragile, but necessary. Ethan had no idea the next few seconds would push him to the edge. As he turned toward the control switch, a burst of white light cracked through the air. A sharp spark leapt from the exposed wire to the metal panel. In that instant, a small flame erupted along the insulation and crawled quickly toward a folded piece of dry cloth left nearby. The flame flared up with alarming speed. Ethan froze. His body locked in place as the sudden brightness and heat sent him spiraling into memory. The crackle of fire became the echo of burning wreckage overseas. The bright flash became the roar of explosions. His heartbeat thrashed violently inside his ribs. His breath vanished. Panic overtook him like a wave. Ranger lunged toward him at once. The dog teeth did not bare, and he did not snarl. Instead, Ranger clamped his jaws onto the thick fabric of Ethan's sleeve and pulled with firm force. Ethan's chest jolted. Ranger dragged him toward the doorway, using his strong legs to push them both away from the growing flame. Ethan stumbled, unable to stop shaking. His vision pulsed with fragments of memory. Ranger barked sharply once, then again. The sound cut through the panic with a precise and grounding force. The dog then sprinted out of the garage and into the yard. He turned toward the road and barked repeatedly, each sound deep and commanding. The noise carried through the still night. Within moments, Harold Dean appeared from the side path. The older mechanic had been walking home from a late errand. His silver hair was damp with mist, and his broad shoulders hunched slightly against the wind. When he heard Ranger urgent calls, he rushed toward the garage, his face tightening with concern. Behind him, Ray Butler and Daniel Kerr arrived from different directions. They had been nearby sorting supplies and recognized Ranger alarm as no ordinary bark. Ethan remained near the doorway, trembling, the panic still gripping him. He watched through blurred eyes as Harold and Ray grabbed a pair of old fire blankets, while Daniel used a wet cloth to smother the smaller flames along the wiring. Ranger stood between Ethan and the chaos, his chest rising and falling as he waited for the danger to pass. The group worked quickly. They stamped out the last glowing ember and cleared the smoldering cloth. The flame had burned only a thin trail along the side panel. When the smoke thinned, the garage fell silent except for Ethan's uneven breaths. Harold knelt beside the engine compartment and examined the wires closely. His aged hands were steady and sure. Daniel inspected the frame, while Ray pulled back the newly replaced insulation. Ranger moved closer to Ethan again and pressed against his leg. Ethan placed a hand on Ranger's head, still shaking slightly. His mind felt raw, but steady enough to return to the present. Harold rose slowly and wiped a smear of soot from his cheek. His voice was calm and firm. He explained that the fire had burned only the exposed wires and scorched a few of the outer panels. The engine itself remained unharmed. Only a handful of cables and a couple of thin metal sheets needed replacing. Daniel and Ray both nodded in agreement. The damage was minor compared to what it could have been. Ethan listened silently. Relief washed through him like a slow wave. The fire had frightened him deeply, but it had not ended the dream. The burned metal seemed almost symbolic now, a reminder of how close failure could come, but also how survivors rose again. The group exchanged glances. Something had shifted. The danger had brought them closer. Harold placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. The gesture was simple but steadying. Daniel and Ray stepped forward with quiet confidence. Mildred Hart would no doubt arrive with food by morning when she heard what had happened. Ranger remained still and alert at Ethan's side. The garage no longer felt like a lonely battleground. It felt like a place where people refused to let one another fall. Ethan looked at the truck with new resolve. The flame had not ended the work. It had revealed the strength of the people around him. And it had shown him once again that Ranger loyalty was deeper than words could ever express. Tonight had nearly broken him. Instead, it united them. The morning sun rose gently over the Appalachian foothills, casting a warm gold light across the quiet clearing. The air carried a mild freshness, touched by the scent of early dew on the grass. A soft breeze drifted between the tall pines surrounding Ethan's home, and the newly restored food truck gleamed beneath the sunlight. The paint was clean, the metal smooth, and the rebuilt engine rested inside with a steady strength that marked the end of months of struggle. Ethan stood beside the truck with his hands resting lightly on the polished counter. His tired blue eyes held a calmer glow now. His face still carried the rugged lines of hardship, but there was a soft ease in his expression. His hair was brushed back, no longer weighed down by exhaustion. He felt a rare sense of quiet peace as he looked at the finished truck. Ranger sat proudly next to him. The German Shepherd coat was brushed and bright in the morning light. His posture was confident with his ears forward, and his amber eyes focused on Ethan. Ranger seemed to understand that the battle was over and a new chapter was beginning. In the weeks that followed the night of the small fire, the group had worked with steady purpose. Harold Dean had replaced the burnt wiring with careful hands. Daniel Kerr and Ray Butler had reinforced the inner panels. Mildred Hart had brought meals every evening until the final bolt was tightened. Together, they had brought the old truck back to life. Ethan often stood in silence during those final days, watching the truck become whole. Each piece repaired felt like a piece healed inside him. On the day the engine roared back to life, the group had smiled quietly, without need for celebration. The sound had meant more than success. It had meant survival. Today marked the first morning of Ethan's new journey. He had chosen the name Ranger's Diner, not only to honor the loyal dog, who had saved him more than once, but also to honor the feeling of protection Ranger had given him through every dark moment. The handwritten sign hung above the serving window. The letters were uneven, but full of sincerity. At first, Ethan felt unsure about opening the diner. The thought of serving people brought a mixture of nervousness and hope. His mind still carried old fears, but the weight of panic that once pressed against him had grown lighter with each repaired step. Ranger nudged his leg gently, as if sensing Ethan's hesitation. Ethan breathed slowly and opened the window. The first group to arrive was a trio of workers from the nearby lumber yard. They were men in their 30s with strong arms, worn boots, and tired but friendly faces. One had a short, dark beard and broad shoulders. Another was lean with sandy hair tucked under a cap. The third had deep brown skin and a calm expression that reminded Ethan of Daniel. They approached with curiosity. The smell of fresh food drifted from the small stove inside the truck. Ethan had prepared simple meals, affordable for workers who spent hard days in labor. He served them quietly, speaking only a few words, but the men smiled with genuine appreciation. Ranger sat by the window, with his chest raised proudly. His presence drew warm attention. Several children who passed by stopped to pet him, and Ranger remained still with patient eyes. Later that afternoon, a small group of school children arrived. They were accompanied by a teacher from the local elementary school. The children ranged in age. Some wore faded jackets. Others carried worn backpacks. Their eyes lit up when Ethan handed out free meals. Ranger greeted each child with gentle nods and wagging tail. Ethan felt something settle deeply inside him as he watched the children eat. The letters he had found from the previous owner returned to his thoughts. Her dream had not ended with her. It had continued through him. As time passed, more people came. Some were curious townsfolk. Some were older veterans drawn by the simple sign that offered free meals for those who had served. They were men with gray hair, heavy boots, and quiet eyes that carried years of memories. Ethan treated each one with respect. He understood the weight they carried. Each customer brought something different: an encouraging word, a story, a thank you. By the end of the first week, the diner had earned enough to cover Ethan's rent and purchase new supplies. He felt a cautious spark of pride. Not the sharp pride that came from victory, but the gentle pride of someone rediscovering purpose. As the days stretched onward, Ethan began offering simple cooking lessons to the teenagers who gathered near the truck. Some were boys from families who struggled with money. Some were quiet girls who wanted to learn a skill for the future. Ethan taught them how to chop vegetables, season meat, and prepare small meals. His voice was patient, his movements slow and steady. Ranger watched every class from a few feet away, guarding the door with loyal silence. The teenagers grew comfortable around Ethan. They laughed more. They asked questions. Ethan felt his heart open in ways he did not expect. The fear that once wrapped tightly around him loosened each time he saw their confidence grow. Months later, the diner became a familiar landmark. Workers stopped by before dawn. Children visited after school. Veterans sat quietly beside the truck in the evenings. Ranger became the symbol of the diner. People brought him treats. Children hugged him. Adults patted his head with warm smiles. Ethan found himself smiling more often. The nights that once held him in fear grew softer. The memories still lived in him, but Ranger's steady presence and the purpose of daily work kept him grounded. The peace he had long thought impossible began to grow. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the hills, Ethan closed the serving window and sat on the small bench outside the truck. Ranger rested beside him with his head against Ethan's leg. Ethan looked at the landscape, the quiet trees, the gentle wind, and felt a stillness that had been missing for years. He had survived the darkness. He had rebuilt more than a truck. He had rebuilt himself. Ranger's Diner had become a place of hope for many, but above all, it had become a home for him and Ranger. A place where they no longer fought alone. A place where they finally found peace. In the quiet glow of the final evening at Ranger's Diner, Ethan looked back on the long road he had walked. The broken memories, the empty nights, the fear and the weight of survival had once felt impossible to bear. Yet through loyalty, kindness, and the steady courage of Ranger, he learned that a single act of hope can turn a life around. The community that gathered around him showed that strength grows when people stand together, and that healing often begins with simple compassion. Ethan's journey became a reminder that no life is too damaged to rise again, and no dream is too small to spark light in others. Some would call it luck. Others would call it hard work. Ethan believed it was a quiet miracle, shaped by God, gentle guidance in moments he did not even notice. As you close this story, may you carry its message into your own days. Let kindness lead you. Let faith steady you. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe for more. May God bless you and watch over you and your family with peace and grace.